And he explained very clearly why Johnny couldn't read. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, the reason Johnny can't read is because the teaching of reading in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense.
I want to jump back to one other foundational educational principle, because I've heard you speak on this before, and I think it's critical to understand this, even in light of the Christian faith, and that is literacy. It seems that education, the foundational measure of education would be, can the people read? Can the people gain their own knowledge, and can they transmit their knowledge? And yet we have a giant literacy crisis in the schools and in culture. How did that happen?
Yeah, and actually that story is intimately intertwined with the emergence of government schools. It's a fascinating story. I'll try to condense it into just a few minutes. So it begins actually very innocently. There's a Reverend Golodet, who had learned from some French monks this new approach to teaching reading. Now, Reverend Golodet was overseeing what they called back then an asylum for the deaf and the dumb in Connecticut. It just was an institution to help children who were deaf and mute and couldn't speak, couldn't hear, to be able to get by in the world, right? It wasn't like today where the Americans with Disabilities Act and everything has to be handicap friendly. It was a very different world back then. And so Reverend Golodet came up with this idea that, hey, these children can't hear, so we certainly can't teach them that a P makes a P sound or a T makes a T sound, and you can blend it with this vowel and it'll make it sound like this, which is, of course, the core of our writing system, right? We have a phonetic writing system where each letter represents one or more, or is a symbol representing one or more sounds, and then you can blend those sounds together. And anything that you can say, you can put down on paper. Well, for a deaf child, that doesn't make any sense because they can't hear what that sound sounds like. And so teaching a child to read phonetically when they're deaf is just not an option. And so Reverend Golodet says, hey, why don't we teach these children to memorize whole words? And that way, they might not be able to memorize all the words in the English language. That would be quite a challenge. But if they're really smart, maybe they can memorize a few hundred, maybe even a couple thousand. And so for the deaf children, this was really a giant success. They went from being able to read absolutely nothing to being able to at least get an understanding of what was on the page. And that was all great. Kudos to Reverend Golodet for his godly efforts to help people who were less fortunate, and we appreciate that. Well, the problem comes when Horace Mann had started setting up these government schools in Massachusetts. He was importing the Prussian system back to the United States. And he had gotten himself selected as the first ever Secretary of Education. We had never had in any state a Secretary of Education. And he thinks, well, hey, if this works so great for the deaf children, I bet it'll work even better for the non-deaf children. So he tells the public schools in Boston that were just getting off the ground to start using this new method to teach reading. Now, the schoolmasters of these Boston schools were quite clever. And within 2 years, they wrote this blistering critique. Actually, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who I worked with very closely, he and I co-authored Crimes of the Educators together over a decade ago. He reprinted this essay as an appendix in one of his books, The New Illiterates from 1973. It's a brilliant essay. They were very polite back then. It wasn't like today where, Trump and Biden call each other names and things. They were very polite. But what they said was, hey, this proposed change that offered by Mr. Mann is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning, right? Which is the 1800s way of saying, you idiot, what are you doing? This doesn't work. We're not going to continue. So that was stopped. We didn't hear about it again until John Dewey comes on the scene. Now, this is really interesting. So John Dewey sets up an experimental school at the University of Chicago with funding from the Rockefeller dynasty and decides, hey, let's try it again. It didn't work back when Horace Mann tried it 50, 60 years ago, but let's try it again and let's see what happens. So they tried out in this experimental school, a $3 million school, and sure enough, they graduated a bunch of kids who couldn't read, including, incidentally, some of the Rockefeller boys. So they think, well, this will be perfect. So John Dewey loves the results of this. He ends up working with some of his buddies, some of his colleagues to create new reading primers based on these principles. And the descendants of those, some of them are still around today, the Dick and Jane readers, see, spot, run, spot, run, right? Teaching kids to memorize whole words. And these, because of the prestige of the University of Chicago, because of the prestige of Teachers College at Columbia University, which even back then was considered, the leading or one of the leading educational colleges in the country. So these start spreading across the United States. Now, after World War II, when there was a lot more money to spare, more and more school districts started buying these programs, and very, very rapidly, we just saw this cataclysm when it came to reading. It was so bad, a book that became a major bestseller at the time, Why Johnny Can't Read, was published in the 1950s. And he explained very clearly why Johnny couldn't read. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, the reason Johnny can't read is because the teaching of reading in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. So that's why Johnny couldn't read. Well, that caused a major scandal. So some of the school districts kind of walked it back a little bit, but the totalitarians were not done. They insisted on continuing this methodology. So Sam Blumenfeld exposes it in 1973 with the New Illiterates. And, fast forward to today, we've got the Common Core that we talked about a little bit earlier. Well, under Common Core, if you read it, in kindergarten, children are going to be, according to the text, memorizing what they call high-frequency words. And so you've got various lists of words they're supposed to memorize. The common ones, the Dolch list, the Fry list, right? And I'm sure some homeschoolers are thinking, oh, no, not the, yeah, those, right? Yep. So they get the kids to memorize all these words. And to kind of get into the mechanics of how this works, right? When you're memorizing a whole word, what they're doing is they're teaching children to see these words as if the word itself is a symbol. Of course, the word is not a symbol. The word is a collection of symbols that has to be deciphered by sounding it out. But when you teach the child to approach the word as if it were a symbol in and of itself, they'll be okay if they can memorize a few hundred. They'll be okay with the very basic books like See, Spot, Run, Spot, Run, because you've memorized run, you've memorized spot, and you've memorized see. But what happens when you get to a word that you haven't memorized? Well, as you look at these reading tools, they say, well, now you have to use your word attack skills. You got to look for context clues, look if there's any pictures on the page, see what the word before and after. This is preposterous, right? So this is a deliberate agenda. And I think the simplest way to understand the true agenda, Garrett, is to go back to the first education law ever passed in North America. This was 1640s, the Old Deluder Satan Act. The Pilgrims said it's so critical that everyone can read, because that old deluder Satan wants to keep them from knowledge of the scriptures, that we're going to make sure every person in this colony can read. Now, it was a Bible colony, right? There was no separation of church and state. And so they said, your town and your church need to make sure everybody can read. And so that's the genesis of universal literacy in America. I think it can be easily demonstrated that John Dewey understood that literacy was the key to, first of all, biblical understanding. Second of all, independence and freedom. If you can't educate yourself, you are a helpless person. Today with YouTube and audiobooks, some of us can overcome that handicap. But 100 years ago, we didn't have YouTube and audiobooks, right? You were completely at the mercy of the education establishment if you couldn't read. So I think this was done deliberately for the purpose of dumbing down Americans so that they could be manipulated into giving up their freedoms, giving up their families, and ultimately surrendering all of the things that God had blessed our nation with, that we were entrusted to be good stewards over.
This episode of Rapid Response was brought to you by CTC Math. Visit them at ctcmath.com today.